Hi guys, tonight we're exploring an acoustic nightmare. What if every sound you've ever made never truly disappeared, but kept echoing forever? Every word, every cough, every footstep reverberating through space and time eternally. If you enjoy these sound-based sleep stories that explore permanent consequences, hit that like button and subscribe for more. And drop a comment letting me know what time it is where you are and where you're listening from. I appreciate hearing from listeners in every time zone. Alright, let's begin. Picture this moment. You clear your throat in your bedroom this morning, and that simple sound begins a journey that will outlast civilizations. The gentle rasp echoes once off your bedroom wall, then again and again, each reflection slightly softer, but never quite disappearing. While you brush your teeth, that throat clearing bounces between buildings outside your window. As you drive to work, it ricochets through your neighborhood, growing fainter but persisting. By evening, it has spread across your city. By next week, it reaches neighboring states, and it never stops. This is the reality we're exploring today. A world where every sound ever produced continues echoing indefinitely, creating an acoustic environment so fundamentally different from our own that it would reshape not just how we communicate, but how we think, how we build our societies, and ultimately how we understand existence itself. In our world, sounds die quickly. The physics of acoustic energy dissipation ensures that even the loudest roar fades to nothing within seconds or minutes. Sound waves lose energy through absorption into materials, scattering in different directions, and conversion to heat through air resistance. A gunshot in an open field becomes inaudible within roughly 800 meters. A conversation at normal volume disappears into background noise at about 50 meters. Even the most powerful sounds ever recorded by humans, like the eruption of Krakatoa in 1883, which could be heard 3,000 miles away, eventually faded into silence. But imagine instead a universe where acoustic energy never dissipates, where every vibration, once created, continues propagating through space indefinitely, bouncing off surfaces and travelling through mediums without losing intensity. In this reality, the fundamental constant that governs sound decay simply doesn't exist. The mathematics of acoustic physics would need complete revision. The coefficient of absorption would be zero for all materials. The inverse square law, which dictates that sound intensity decreases with the square of distance, would still apply to the initial propagation, but reflected sounds would maintain their energy indefinitely through endless bouncing. Consider what this means for the sounds happening right now as you listen to these words. Every syllable being spoken exists simultaneously, with every other sound occurring across the planet at this moment. In Beijing, where 22 million people are going about their daily lives, every conversation, every car engine, every construction hammer strike is beginning its eternal journey. In São Paulo, Brazil's largest city with 12 million inhabitants, the cacophony of urban life launches into perpetual existence. The rumble of New York City's subway system, carrying 5.5 million passengers daily through 468 stations across 122 miles of track, becomes part of an ever-growing symphony that will outlive the tunnels themselves. The immediate consequence would be the most spectacular acoustic chaos imaginable. Within hours of this phenomenon beginning, every major population center would become uninhabitable due to noise levels. Los Angeles, with its 10 million residents spread across 4,700 square miles, would generate approximately 40 billion distinct sounds per day from human activity alone. Each conversation between two people produces roughly 160 distinct phonemes per minute. Multiply this by the city's population engaged in conversation at any given time, add vehicle noise, construction, aircraft, and industrial activity, and the acoustic density becomes incomprehensible. But the mathematics reveal something even more staggering. If we consider that the average person produces approximately 16,000 sounds per day through speech, breathing, movement, and other activities, and multiply this by Earth's current population of 8 billion people, we generate 128 trillion new sounds daily. Each of these sounds would begin bouncing between surfaces, creating secondary echoes, tertiary reflections, and an exponentially expanding network of acoustic energy that fills every available space. The reflection patterns would follow precise geometric principles, but their complexity would exceed our ability to predict or map them. In a typical urban environment, sound waves encounter reflective surfaces every few meters. A single spoken word in downtown Manhattan would bounce off glass facades, concrete sidewalks, metal surfaces and vehicles, creating hundreds of reflection paths within the first second. Each reflection generates its own set of subsequent reflections. Within minutes, that single word would exist in thousands of simultaneous echoes throughout the city, each taking a different path, each maintaining its original acoustic signature. The speed of sound in air at room temperature is approximately 343 meters per second. This means that sounds travel roughly 1,235 kilometers per hour. In a world of eternal echoes, every sound you make would reach locations progressively farther from its source. A shout produced in Paris would echo off buildings and terrain features, eventually reaching London 475 kilometers away in about 23 minutes if travelling directly. But actual reflection paths would be far more complex and take considerably longer. Within a day, that Parisian shout would be bouncing around Scotland. Within a week, it would be ricocheting through Scandinavia. But these calculations assume Earth's surface remains the boundary for acoustic propagation. The reality would be far more complex. Sound waves would reflect off atmospheric layers, creating vertical bouncing patterns that could carry sounds to the edge of space and back. The stratosphere, located between 10 and 50 kilometers above Earth's surface, contains temperature inversions that can reflect acoustic waves. In our hypothetical universe, these atmospheric reflections would create a three-dimensional echo chamber encompassing the entire planet. The acoustic environment would evolve in phases, each more overwhelming than the last. In the first hour, local echoes would dominate. Every room would fill with the persistent reverberations of recent activities. A typical office building housing 2,000 workers would become acoustically saturated within minutes. Each keystroke on the building's computers, estimated at roughly 800,000 keystrokes per hour during peak work time, would contribute to an impossible cacophony. Phone conversations, printer operations, air conditioning systems, elevator movements, and footsteps would layer upon each other in an impenetrable wall of sound. By the end of the first day, neighborhood-scale echo patterns would emerge. Residential areas with their distinct acoustic signatures would create regional sound environments. A suburban neighborhood of 1,000 homes would generate approximately 40 million sounds daily from residents, pets, appliances, and vehicles. These sounds would bounce between houses, off pavement, through trees, and off power lines, creating a complex web of intersecting echoes that would make any individual sound impossible to distinguish. Within a week, continental echo patterns would establish themselves. The acoustic signature of major cities would propagate across entire regions. The distinctive sounds of London, with its 8.5 million residents, would begin echoing through the British countryside. The roar of traffic from London's 8,700 miles of roads would bounce off hills and valleys, eventually reaching Edinburgh 150 kilometres to the north. Meanwhile, Edinburgh's own acoustic signature would be travelling south, and when these two city-sized ecosystems met somewhere in northern England, they would create interference patterns of unimaginable complexity. The interference phenomena would produce entirely new categories of acoustic experience. When two sound waves of similar frequency meet, they can amplify each other through constructive interference or cancel each other through destructive interference. With billions of persistent echoes travelling in all directions, certain locations would become acoustic hotspots where multiple echoes converge and amplify, while others would become relative quiet zones where waves cancel each other out. These patterns would shift constantly as new sounds join the eternal symphony, and existing echoes change their path through reflection. Ocean acoustics would create planetary-scale echo chambers. Sound travels approximately 4 times faster in water than in air, at roughly 1,500 meters per second in seawater. The ocean's SOFAR channel, a naturally occurring acoustic waveguide at depths between 700 and 1,000 meters, can carry sounds across entire ocean basins with minimal energy loss. In our echo-eternal world, every sound that reached the ocean would propagate globally through these underwater channels. A conversation on a beach in California would echo underwater to Japan, Australia, and Alaska simultaneously. Whales and dolphins, which already use complex acoustic communication across vast ocean distances, would find their communication systems completely overwhelmed. Blue whales produce calls that can travel hundreds of kilometers underwater. A single blue whale's call, echoing eternally through the SOFAR channel, would eventually circle the globe multiple times, interfering with every other whale's attempts to communicate. The current global blue whale population of approximately 25,000 individuals would create a perpetual underwater cacophony that would fundamentally alter marine ecosystem dynamics. The biological implications extend far beyond marine life. Most animals rely heavily on acoustic information for survival. Bats use echolocation, with calls reaching frequencies up to 200,000 Hz, well beyond human hearing range. These calls typically last only a few milliseconds and fade quickly, allowing bats to process returning echoes and navigate precisely. In a world of eternal echoes, every bat's echolocation call would persist indefinitely, creating an acoustic environment where no bat could distinguish its own navigation signals from the billions of other acoustic inputs filling the air. Birds depend on acoustic communication for territory establishment, mating rituals, and flock coordination. The dawn chorus, where birds sing most actively in early morning hours, involves millions of individual birds worldwide. If every note of every dawn chorus from every day continued echoing eternally, the accumulated acoustic density would make bird communication impossible. Migratory species that navigate using acoustic landmarks would become completely disoriented in an environment where every landmark sound persists indefinitely. Human psychology would undergo radical transformation under these acoustic conditions. Our brains have evolved sophisticated filtering mechanisms to focus on relevant sounds while ignoring background noise. The cocktail party effect allows us to follow a single conversation in a noisy room by selectively attending to specific acoustic patterns. But these mechanisms have limits. Research shows that sustained exposure to noise levels above 85 decibels can cause permanent hearing damage, while levels above 120 decibels cause immediate pain and potential injury. In major cities, normal ambient noise levels already range from 60 to 80 decibels during the day. Adding eternal echoes of every sound ever produced in those cities would push noise levels far beyond human tolerance. The accumulated acoustic energy from just one day's worth of eternal echoes in New York City would exceed the pain threshold everywhere within the city limits. Within a week, noise levels would be sufficient to cause physical damage to anyone not wearing substantial hearing protection. The psychological impact would be equally devastating. Sleep requires relative quiet, typically below 30 decibels for optimal rest. The eternal echo environment would make natural sleep impossible anywhere on Earth. Human beings deprived of proper sleep experience cognitive impairment, emotional instability, and eventually complete psychological breakdown. Studies of sleep deprivation show significant performance degradation after just 24 hours without sleep, and hallucinations beginning after approximately 72 hours. Communication would become the first casualty of eternal echoes. Human speech operates within a frequency range of roughly 80 to 1200 Hz, with most linguistic information carried in frequencies below 4000 Hz. In an environment where billions of eternal echoes fill these same frequency ranges, distinguishing any individual voice would be impossible. Every attempt at conversation would compete with every other conversation ever held in that acoustic environment. Written language would necessarily become the primary form of communication, but even this would face challenges. The sound of pencils on paper, keyboards clicking, and printers operating would contribute to the eternal echo problem. A typical office worker types approximately 8,000 keystrokes per day. In a building with 1,000 workers, that represents 8 million keystrokes daily, each contributing its own eternal echo to the acoustic chaos. Educational systems would collapse entirely. Traditional classroom instruction depends on students being able to hear and understand their teachers. In an eternal echo environment, no teacher's voice could compete with the accumulated acoustic noise. Distance learning would become mandatory, but even video conferences would be impossible due to microphone systems being overwhelmed by ambient acoustic chaos. The economic implications would be staggering. Industries dependent on acoustic communication would cease to function immediately. Call centers, which employ approximately 3.4 million people in the United States alone, would become completely obsolete. The global call center industry, valued at approximately $350 billion annually, would disappear overnight. Airlines, which rely on verbal communication between pilots and air traffic controllers, would have to ground all flights immediately. The global airline industry, worth roughly $780 billion annually, would collapse. Construction work would become exponentially more dangerous. Construction sites rely heavily on verbal communication for safety coordination. Workers need to hear warnings, equipment operation sounds, and coordination signals. In an eternal echo environment, construction workers would be effectively deaf to all safety-critical acoustic information. The construction industry employs roughly 7.6 million people in the United States and generates approximately $1.8 trillion in annual economic activity. All of this would halt immediately. Manufacturing facilities would face similar challenges. Many industrial processes depend on acoustic monitoring to detect equipment malfunctions, quality control issues, and safety problems. The eternal echo environment would make such monitoring impossible. Global manufacturing produces approximately $14 trillion in output annually. The portion dependent on acoustic monitoring and communication would cease operation immediately. Transportation systems would require complete redesign. Vehicles currently use horns, sirens, and other acoustic warning systems for safety. Emergency vehicles depend on sirens to clear traffic paths. In an eternal echo environment, no warning signal could be distinguished from background noise. The global automotive industry, worth approximately $4 trillion annually, would need to develop entirely new safety and communication systems based on visual or other non-acoustic methods. Urban planning would need fundamental revision. Cities are currently designed with some consideration for acoustic environments, but these considerations assume that sounds dissipate naturally. Zoning laws separate noisy industrial areas from quiet residential neighborhoods, based on the principle that distance reduces sound intensity. In an eternal echo world, distance would provide no acoustic relief. Every neighborhood would eventually receive echoes from every other neighborhood, making current zoning principles meaningless. Building architecture would require revolutionary changes. Current building design incorporates some acoustic considerations, but these assume temporary sound events. Materials are chosen for their aesthetic and structural properties, with acoustic properties being secondary considerations. In an eternal echo environment, every surface becomes an acoustic reflector contributing to the global ecosystem. Buildings would need to be designed as acoustic absorption systems, using materials that somehow circumvent the eternal echo physics. The development of new technologies would become humanity's primary survival requirement. Some form of personal acoustic isolation would be essential for basic human function. This might involve sealed environments with artificial air circulation systems, similar to spacesuits but designed for acoustic rather than atmospheric protection. The technology industry would need to pivot completely toward developing these survival systems. Alternative communication methods would need rapid development and deployment. Visual communication systems would become essential, but these would need to function in the chaotic environment created by eternal echoes. Sign language would experience a renaissance, but would need to be simplified and standardized globally for universal adoption. Written communication would become more important, but would need to be facilitated by technologies that don't produce acoustic signatures. Electronic communication would face unique challenges. Speaker systems would be useless in the eternal echo environment. Visual displays would become the only viable output method for electronic devices. Input methods would need to avoid acoustic generation, ruling out traditional keyboards and voice recognition systems. Touch screens and gesture recognition would become the primary interfaces for all electronic systems. The scientific implications would be profound. Acoustic research would become simultaneously the most important and most impossible field of study. Understanding the eternal eco-environment would be crucial for human survival, but studying it would require working in acoustic conditions that would make normal research impossible. Scientists would need to develop completely new methodologies for acoustic analysis that don't depend on being able to hear individual sounds. Astronomical observations would be affected in unexpected ways. While space is generally considered acoustically silent, the eternal echo environment on Earth would affect radio astronomy and other forms of electromagnetic observation. Many radio telescopes are sensitive to ground vibrations and acoustic interference. The constant acoustic chaos would create vibrations in all ground-based equipment, potentially making detailed astronomical observations impossible. Seismology would become chaotic. Earthquake detection systems rely on distinguishing seismic waves from background noise. In an eternal echo environment, the constant acoustic bombardment would create continuous ground vibrations that would interfere with seismographic equipment. Earthquake prediction and monitoring, which are crucial for public safety in seismically active regions, would become nearly impossible. Weather prediction would face complications. Some atmospheric monitoring systems use acoustic techniques to measure wind speeds, temperature gradients, and precipitation patterns. These systems would be overwhelmed by the eternal echo environment, potentially reducing the accuracy of weather forecasting at a time when precise prediction would be more important than ever for coordinating human survival activities. Agricultural systems would experience disruption through effects on pollinating insects. Many pollinating species, including bees, use acoustic communication for hive coordination and navigation. Honeybees produce various sounds for communication, including the famous waggle dance, which incorporates acoustic elements to convey distance and direction information to food sources. The eternal echo environment would disrupt these communication systems, potentially affecting pollination of crops that feed billions of people. The global food supply chain depends heavily on acoustic communication at every level, from farm machinery operators coordinating harvest to truck drivers receiving loading instructions to retail workers managing inventory. All of these communication-dependent processes would need redesign for visual or other non-acoustic methods. The disruption would be massive and immediate, potentially affecting food security for Earth's entire population. International relations would be transformed by the shared nature of the acoustic crisis. The eternal echo phenomenon would affect every nation simultaneously and equally. Unlike most global challenges, which affect some regions more than others, the acoustic chaos would be truly universal. Every government would face identical challenges in maintaining basic societal functions. This could either promote unprecedented international cooperation as nations share solutions, or it could lead to conflict as resources become scarce and communication between nations becomes difficult. Military operations would be revolutionized. Modern warfare depends heavily on acoustic intelligence, from detecting approaching vehicles to coordinating troop movements through verbal communication. Stealth operations, which rely on avoiding acoustic detection, would become meaningless when every sound persists eternally. Naval warfare would be particularly affected, since sonar systems would be completely overwhelmed by the accumulation of eternal underwater echoes. Cultural implications would be enormous. Music, as an art form, would be fundamentally transformed. Traditional musical performance would be impossible when every note ever played continues echoing indefinitely. New forms of musical expression would need to develop, possibly based on visual or tactile elements rather than acoustic ones. The global music industry, worth approximately $57 billion annually, would need complete reimagining. Language itself would evolve rapidly under these conditions. Spoken language would become primarily historical, used only in isolated, acoustically controlled environments. Written and visual languages would expand dramatically to replace the communication functions previously served by speech. Sign languages would become more important than spoken languages for the first time in human history. Religious and spiritual practices would undergo major changes. Most religious traditions incorporate acoustic elements like singing, chanting, prayer, and musical instruments. Places of worship would become acoustically impossible environments for traditional practices. Religious communities would need to develop new forms of spiritual expression that don't depend on sound. This could lead to interesting innovations in spiritual practice, but would also represent a major disruption to traditions that have existed for thousands of years. The philosophical implications challenge our understanding of permanence and impermanence. In our current world, the temporary nature of sound contributes to our concept of time and change. Conversations end, music fades, and moments pass partly because their acoustic signatures dissipate. In an eternal echo environment, every spoken word would persist as a permanent feature of the universe. This would create a physical record of human activity unlike anything previously imagined. Privacy would become a completely alien concept. Every conversation would echo eternally through the environment, making private communication impossible unless conducted in specially designed acoustic isolation chambers. The social implications of this loss of privacy would reshape human relationships fundamentally. Intimate conversations, confidential business discussions, and personal secrets would all become part of the permanent acoustic landscape. Mental health challenges would be unprecedented. Humans require periods of quiet for psychological well-being. Meditation, contemplation, and simple rest all depend on relatively quiet environments. The eternal echo world would eliminate the possibility of natural quiet anywhere on Earth. This would likely lead to widespread anxiety, depression, and other psychological disorders on a scale never before encountered. Sleep disorders would become universal. Human beings require approximately 8 hours of sleep per 24-hour cycle for optimal health. Sleep typically requires ambient noise levels below 30 decibels, In the eternal echo environment, achieving such quiet conditions would be impossible without technological intervention. The health consequences of widespread sleep deprivation would be catastrophic, potentially affecting human lifespan, cognitive function, and physical health globally. The adaptation period would be brutal but fascinating. Humans have demonstrated remarkable adaptability throughout history, surviving ice ages, plagues, wars, and natural disasters. The eternal echo scenario would represent perhaps the most challenging adaptation requirement in human history, but it's possible that over time, new social structures, technologies, and survival strategies would emerge. Children born into the eternal echo world would develop differently from previous generations. Their brains would adapt to process the chaotic acoustic environment in ways that older generations couldn't manage. They might develop enhanced visual processing capabilities to compensate for the loss of useful acoustic information. Their language development would be fundamentally different, possibly leading to new forms of human communication that previous generations couldn't imagine. Long-term human evolution would be affected. Natural selection would favor individuals better adapted to the eternal echo environment. This might include people with enhanced visual acuity, better ability to filter acoustic chaos, or other traits that provide advantages in the new acoustic reality. Over many generations, these adaptations could lead to measurable changes in human sensory capabilities and brain structure. The scenario reveals the profound interconnectedness between human civilization and the physical properties of our environment. We rarely consider how dependent our societies are on the temporary nature of sound. The eternal echo world would force a complete reconceptualization of human culture, technology, communication, and social organization. It would be simultaneously the greatest challenge and the greatest catalyst for innovation in human history. As we contemplate this impossible acoustic future, we gain new appreciation for the temporary nature of the sounds around us. Every conversation, every song, every moment of acoustic beauty exists briefly and then fades into silence. This impermanence, which we might sometimes regret, actually enables the complexity and richness of our acoustic environment. In a world where every sound echoed forever, the very abundance of acoustic information would make meaningful acoustic communication impossible. The eternal echo scenario ultimately illuminates the delicate balance that makes human civilization possible. Our world works because sounds fade, conversations end, and moments pass. The silence between sounds is as important as the sounds themselves. In exploring this impossible acoustic reality, we discover not just the chaos that eternal echoes would create, but the subtle perfection of the temporary acoustic world we actually inhabit.